Books and education. Well, let's go back to something we talked about earlier in this lecture, which is the word literacy and literature. So, literature, let's start with that. It's a noun. Book learning, from Latin literatura, learning, a writing, grammar, writing formed with letters. Also, an epistle, meaning a letter, writing document, literature, great book, science, learning. Book learning. So literature has to do with book learning. And obviously the word literacy comes from the word literature, quality or state of being literate, especially the ability to read and write, possession of an education, a person's knowledge of a particular subject or field. So when we talk about media literacy, we're talking about your knowledge of media. So it's interesting that books are the foundation of the idea of learning. We think about books and book learning and literacy. And this is from a slide actually created by the authors of the textbook, Alliteracy, where people possess the ability to read but choose not to do so. What kind of culture develops when its population refuses to read? For that crime, a person pays with his whole life. If the offender is a nation, it pays with its history. People who don't read don't know history. So we'll go back to Abraham Lincoln teaching himself. This is, it's either a facsimile or it's a real copy of one of his lesson books. Okay, so in those days in the frontier, when he grew up in the 1830s in Illinois, in the woods, in a one-room cabin with a dirt floor, and candlelight and firelight to read by. He got hold of lesson books, and he was working on his figures, and his numbers, and his arithmetic, and he's working on his letters and writing, and getting hold of books and reading. Here's a picture of Abraham Lincoln when he was president, reading to his son. I think this is Tad. He had 3 sons at the beginning of his term in the White House. Robert, who went off to Harvard and lived a fairly long life. Willie and Tad, the younger boys. And Willie died in the White House, probably of drinking water. They got their water directly from the Potomac River, you can imagine. But here is Abraham Lincoln reading with his young son. The young son is presumably learning something. An autodidact is someone who educates herself, like Abraham Lincoln. Here's another autodidact of around the same time period. This is Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass began life as a slave, and he, because of the people who were his slave owners, a few of them being kind-hearted and recognizing that this was a very bright child, gave him books, and he had some classes along with their son. And he taught himself. They helped teach him to read, and he took it from there. This is the book that he had through his childhood and young adulthood, The Columbian Orator, Original and Selected Pieces. He read speeches, and he learned how to be a fabulous speaker, so they say, and writer. He wrote an autobiography. He wrote several of them. Published in 1845. Um, he became an orator. He traveled around the country with several other people, giving speeches about the evils of slavery. And here was a man who could speak who had actually been a slave himself. So he was almost one of the only black speakers on this subject. Um, Very amazing story. He met Abraham Lincoln famously in the White House several times around the time of the Civil War. He liked Lincoln. Um, but two autodidacts, very important men, using books to learn. I just read this morning. This guy, his last name is Cosby, lives in the South. He's a writer, an increasingly successful writer of, I guess, suspense and mystery stories set in the South. And this fits different places in today's lecture on books. It's partly, if you read the article, about someone who is discovered by a book agent, and the agent works with him, and he gets his books published. He has had several published now, and I think at least one of them has been bought. I think Jerry Bruckheimer has bought one of the movie rights. So what you so often see these days is books as the source of film and TV content again and again and again. If somebody has a good book and a hot book, just at the same time people are working on publishing rights, if the author's already somewhat known, the agent is probably negotiating the film rights. And this is the closing of the nice New York Times article about this fellow. He like Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. He went to school, but he also, quote, read everything, unquote. And he talks about you can be poor, but you can educate yourself for free. Books is education. Okay, I'm going to now talk about censorship, but I'm going to do that as a separate